Thank you, Peter. Quick caveat before I get started. This is a case study about how we're using Python. We're not actually going to look at any Python source. The focus is on the high-level problems we are using Python to solve. So if you want to look at some really hard Python code, you've got a minute to jump to the room next door. When you think of electricity, what do you think of? What image comes into your mind? Perhaps it's a lightning strike on a stormy day. Perhaps it's a domestic appliance like a kettle or a hot plate. Sorry about the retro images. Perhaps it's a machine from the new world like an EV or a flat screen TV or maybe a wind farm. Where Josh and I work, when we think of electricity, we think of a perfectly formed sine wave with a frequency of exactly 50 hertz, created by machines as big as a house, spinning at precisely 3,000 RPM, dotted around the country, all spinning in precise harmony. This rotating mass leads to grid stability. Life was simple in the early days of what we now call the NEM, or the National Electricity Market. Josh and I work for AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator. Josh leads AEMO's data science team within operational forecasting, where they're responsible for predicting the impact of the weather on consumer behaviour and consumer behaviour on both energy supply and energy demand. I support AEMO's power system engineers with an in-house tool called AMP, the AEMO modelling platform. We use this for modelling the grid for forward-looking analysis and backward-looking fault studying. The topics we're going to squeeze into the next 30 minutes together are as follows: what AEMO does, how generation is changing, why Python, and how we use the weather forecast to help predict energy supply and energy demand. A couple of bullet points about AEMO first of all. AEMO was established by COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, on the 1st of July 2009 to manage the National Electricity Market, or NEM, in the eastern states. Our predecessor, NEMCO, began operating the NEM in December 98. I started with NEMCO August the following year. AEMO has around about 1,200 staff from 6 offices around 5 states. We're broadly divided into teams that support the markets, mostly C# folk, teams that support the grids, or the physics, mostly Python and R folk, and other supporting roles that you'd expect of an enterprise our size. We support the NEM with 2 identical control rooms in 2 states, operating in parallel, each consuming full control of the grid. The WEM, or Western Australian market, is operated out of a control room in Perth, while gas is controlled from Melbourne. The NEM delivers around about 200 terawatt hours of electricity to customers every year, with around about $11.5 billion being traded. Now, I have no idea what 200 terawatt hours of electricity looks like, or what 11.5 billion looks like, so I did a comparison. Australia's defence budget is about 52 billion per annum, so our trade in wholesale electricity is about a quarter of what we spend on defence. I don't know if that helps get the scale in your head. The day the transition began. Australia's transition to renewables began on the 17th of February 2005, when our first grid-scale wind farm became visible to AEMO's control systems. Wind farms have very different physical characteristics than those rotating masses I spoke about earlier. Prior to February 2005, the grid looked like this. Black circles indicate the location of black coal-powered generators. Brown circles indicate the location of brown coal-fired generators. Blue circles, hydro, and red, other, gas, diesel and biofuel. The diameter of the circle indicates the installed capacity of the generator. Prior to Feb 2005, we had 305 units to interact with and around about 42 gigawatts of installed capacity. Roll forward to today and the picture is very different. You almost can't see the coast on this map because of all the coloured dots. Yellow indicates solar, either grid scale or what we call DER or distributed energy resources, behind the meter on residence and small business rooftops. Green indicates wind. Blue and black and brown are coal and hydro, as in the previous screen. An interesting thing to note is biofuel down the bottom. 3 units, 91 megawatts. We have 3 units in northern Queensland generating using waste product from sugarcane production, from sugar production. It's exactly the same as it was back in 2005. This changing of the grid generation profile presents us with many engineering challenges. First of all, the loss of what we call synchronous machines, those machines with rotating mass, as we transition to inverter-based generation, or IBRs. This makes it much harder to control that perfectly formed sine wave. We have the transition from centralized generation to distributed generation, or DER, distributed energy resources. This increases the number of units we must interact with. We have the transition from dispatchable energy, energy created by a machine that we have control over, to variable energy or variable renewable energy. We tend to like to take everything that the weather can give us. As DER penetration grows, we must plan for two-way flows, and the grid was not designed to manage two-way flows. We are planning for a 2 to 5-fold increase in demand for electricity to support the decarbonisation of other sectors of the economy. And we must manage between 5 and 20 times increase in data volumes. How do we get the generation mix right? This table shows some fuel sources or some energy sources we have access to on the left-hand column. And it shows some characteristics that a generator with those energy sources bring to the grid across the top. Coal, for example, has a very slow start-up time. We call it ramp rate. Coal is very high, has a high carbon intensity. It is dispatchable. We can, however, send a signal to it and say we want more or we want less. It brings rotating mass to the grid, which gives the grid stability. Geographically, it tends to be located far away from the load centres. Gas has a fast start time. It's carbon intensive, but not as high as coal. It's dispatchable. It has rotating mass, and it can be close to the load centres, meaning less transmission. Hydro, fast start time, low carbon intensity, dispatchable, rotating mass, generally a long way from load centres. PV, no start time, we take everything we can get. Low carbon intensity, dispatchable, no, like I said, we take everything we can get. No rotating mass, and it can be embedded in the load centre on your rooftop or a long way from a load centre. We have a lot of PV resources in northwestern Victoria, for example. Wind, low carbon intensity, variable, no rotating mass, long way from the load centres. Batteries, very fast start time, low carbon intensity. They're dispatchable, but they're a shallow storage. They don't hold a huge amount of energy, so they're good for injecting power to solve short-term losses. They have no rotating mass, and they can be embedded close to the load centre. Finally, other engineering challenges we face are cyber risks, as nation states realise that they can attack critical infrastructure as part of their toolkit. And, like all of us, finding engineers is a challenge. What's driving the growth of renewables? First of all, ageing and retiring legacy assets. The kit that we built 30 years ago is coming to the end of life. Secondly, firmed or storage-backed renewables are the lowest cost generation we can build today. To decarbonise our economy, we must scale electricity production by a factor of 2 to replace oil and gas that is currently used for space heating, cooking, low temperature industrial heat and transport. And finally, diversity in energy source and geography leads to a more resilient network. What's our record for variable renewable energy? For half an hour on the 28th of October 2022, renewables supplied 68.7% of the NEM generation. This graph shows our personal best to date and is available on our public-facing website. What's the future for variable renewable energy? The solid line, second from the top, shows the maximum penetration of variable renewables against time by quarter. You can see a slight up and down of the curve as it tracks the seasons. Of course, we get less variable in winter and we get more in summer. But the graph is trending slowly upwards. If you draw a line of best fit through the graph and extrapolate to the point where it crosses the 100% mark, you'll see it intersects at some time in 2025. So our goal is to have the control mechanisms in place to manage the grid at 100% variable renewable energy by sometime in 2025. We model the grid with a variety of technologies, but also with Python. The image on the right shows a model of the wind farm we looked at in the picture at the start of the talk. The circle with the cross through it at the bottom is used to represent a generator. Many wind turbines are collapsed down to one point in this model. The horizontal blue bar represents what we call a bus. My mental picture of what a bus is, it's the lump of copper where things are bolted to. The solid square is a breaker or switch. And the overlapping circles are a transformer. We modelled the design of the grid with the help of Python. We modelled the flows within the grid with the help of Python. We modelled distributed energy resources or rooftop solar with the help of Python, and we moved data around with the help of Python. Why did we choose Python? The market people, those interested in the dollars of the grid, are generally Java or C# folk. The grid people, those of us interested in the physics of the grid, tend to be Python or Fortran or R people. Python is an elegant, beautiful, accessible, scalable language, but everybody in this room knows that. Python has advanced tooling, formatters, linters, PyTest, coverage, and maths libraries, but everybody in this room knows that too. We chose Python as we scale our engineering-centric development efforts because of access to an in-house workforce. When a graduate power system engineer joins us from university, they come trained with Python. We have a formal training program that lifts their desktop coding skills to what is necessary to write high availability software that will run unsupervised in the cool room. What else do we use Python for? We use it to manipulate network models, to publish APIs. We use it for personal workflow automation, for personal data wrangling, and for data science, as Josh will talk about in a moment. What does the data flow look like within our organisation? We receive data from many sources. We have marketing meters that are high accuracy calibrated devices that are used to control the market. We have SCADA meters that are of lower accuracy that measure volts and amps. We have devices called PMUs, or phaser measurement units, machines or monitors that follow the precise shape of that sine wave I spoke about. We have APIs where market participants can submit data. We receive DER or rooftop solar information from third-party data providers, and we receive weather information from third-party data providers. Data is ingested with a combination of C#, Python, and Java. We store our data in Oracle, SQL Server, and PostSQL, and we perform analytics with C#, Python, and R. We use the outputs to make operational decisions, and we use the outputs to perform desktop analysis. What does a visualization look like? This graph is taken from an in-house or a power system engineer developed tool called Plotting Buddy. The blue line is taken from one of our high-speed monitoring devices and shows the response of the grid to a disturbance. A disturbance might be a grounding of a line or a lightning strike. The green line shows the response of our models to that disturbance. So what we're doing here is studying the accuracy of the models against reality. And this model's looking pretty good, but it could do with a little bit of tweaking. This graph shows a trace coming out of northwestern Victoria. Northwestern Victoria has a very high penetration of grid-scale solar. Grid-scale solar does not bring that rotating mass I spoke about, so it's vulnerable to disturbance. We have a Python system that is watching the flow of data as it's ingested into AEMO, looking for oscillations like this. The tech is NumPy and SciPy performing a fast Fourier transformation, looking for changes to the shape of the sine wave. Before I hand over to Josh, AEMO's first line of Python was written in 2010 to automate power flow studies. We started our Python journey at scale in August 2018, soon after some of us attended PyCon in Sydney. Our first task was to rewrite a complex algorithm from Pascal. 70,000 lines of Pascal became 14,000 lines of Python, and it took 4 months. We worked out that it cost around about $14 per line of Pascal to rewrite. We now have 71,000 lines of production quality Python at AEMO, with 52,000 lines of automated unit tests. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Peter. So, as Peter touched on, I work for the operational forecasting division, and we'll get into what that actually means in the next couple of slides. But before we do that, just another brief overview of the NEM by the numbers. So we've got the eastern states in pink. And interesting facts to note there is that the installed utility scale solar is now at nearly 9 gigawatts, whereas the rooftop solar on families' homes is at nearly 17 gigawatts, which is nearly double that. And approximately 3 million homes in Australia now have rooftop PV systems installed, which is some of the highest in the world. Another brief point worth mentioning is that when we build our machine learning models, we can't simply have a single model for all states. Each region has its own unique physical and weather-based characteristics, which we need to take account for. And again, just calling out on that red box, the incredibly high penetration of DPV in South Australia, where we are today, reaching up to around 93% at certain intervals, which is a lot higher than the 68% average for the entire NEM that Peter mentioned earlier. So what do we do in operational forecasting? Well, we produce forecasts, to put it bluntly, but we forecast the load or demand, and then we also forecast supply for variable renewable generation, such as the utility scale solar and wind farms, as well as all the millions of solar PV panels on people's roofs. We do this for 5 minutes ahead, up to 1 week ahead, every 5 minutes. And that adds up pretty quickly to us producing approximately 3 million point forecasts every single day. If that doesn't keep us busy enough, we also have a number of other roles. We work very closely with the control rooms that Peter mentioned, providing situational awareness and live weather briefings to them. We also help facilitate the onboarding of new wind and solar farms as we provide forecasts for those and facilitate them providing their own self-forecasts where they are able to outcompete with us. Apart from the documentation, which is immense, we also have a fair amount of international engagement with other independent system operators, or ISOs, as well as other forecasting experts and commercial entities. We're in quite a unique position in Australia, particularly in South Australia, with our world-leading penetration of rooftop PV, that the rest of the world looks to us on how we're solving these problems as a lead indicator on what they will have to deal with in the future. So we really are working on the coalface, so to speak. This is just a very brief summary of some of our forecasting processes and some of those data from the data flows that Peter touched on earlier. But what this is really highlighting is we take in a vast array of different types of data. We train our models on historic data, we have real-time data, and then the weather, now that we couple our generation to chaotic weather systems as a fuel source, you can imagine that weather inputs are quite key to the accuracy of our models. And we take those in from a number of vendors in a number of formats, both point forecasts, numerical gridded forecasts, satellite imagery, and we also have a direct sample of a statistically significant number of rooftop PV systems around the country, which we use to estimate the overall 3 million systems on people's roofs. This slide touches on something else which is worth drawing attention to. When we publish forecasts to the market, we publish a single deterministic forecast as well as a POE 90 and a POE 10. But behind the scenes, there's actually a lot more going on. We have a large number of machine learning models calibrated and tuned slightly differently, all running simultaneously. And we then have other models which ensemble those in a consensus approach to get the most accurate forecast possible. This technique has been used with great success for many years in the weather industry and is now adopted in other industries like ours. It also has the added benefit of producing risk analysis and probabilistic forecasting as well, which we use for our risk assessments and to assess scenarios in the control room. We also produce other custom tooling, like those to forecast high wind and temperature cutouts of wind farms, again for situational awareness. And you may recognize some of the open source plotting libraries behind you in some of those charts and dashboards. So there's some important trends that are affecting us. One is the growth in VRE and DPV, which Peter mentioned. But there's also the change in shape of the generation profile over the day, which we'll touch on shortly. But probably the most important is the increased uncertainty we face as we couple our fuel source to chaotic weather systems. This slide briefly highlights the growth in utility scale wind and solar assets over the last, well, since 2015, should I say. And from this picture, the key takeaway is that from 2015 to 17, it was predominantly large-scale wind farms and not much change. But from 2018 onwards, there was really an explosive growth of new utility-scale solar farms, and that continued to outpace wind. And at the end of 2022, there are now more utility-scale solar farms in Australia than there are wind farms, and a total of 150 utility-scale, well, greater than 150 utility-scale assets out in the field today. And we only foresee that to keep on growing. So how does this look during a typical day? So this chart shows the generation stack in South Australia. Again, it provides a good example, and it's close to home. So this is looking at a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight. And you can see there that overnight, obviously the sun is not shining, so the majority of demand is met from conventional plants such as gas in South Australia, as well as imports from other states like Victoria, and a component of wind, which does fortunately blow during the nighttime. Then as the sun rises, you can see that solar really takes a large chunk out of that and displaces a lot of the conventional fuel. However, as Peter mentioned, solar does not have grid stability provisions, and hence we often have to direct on conventional gas plant to maintain system security in South Australia. So that's where you can see it dipping below the zero line, and then we'll be exporting excess to Victoria as well. And then challenging periods come when the sun starts to ramp down. The conventional plant then needs to be able to ramp up quickly again to meet demand for the evening peak. And you can imagine in such a dynamic system, the accuracy of our forecasts to ensure that the system is able to meet this change is pretty crucial. This little GIF, or GIF, if you're that way inclined, shows the evolution in the penetration of renewable energy in South Australia. So 2008, you can see really low penetration on the vertical axis, around about 12%, and it's all wind. Skip forward only 10 years to 2018, and you can see that wind has grown massively, backed up with a fair chunk of rooftop PV, and it's happily hitting 75% penetration in South Australia, but it also ramps down pretty low as well. And then fast forward to 21, and you've got your utility scale solar, massively large quantities of rooftop PV and wind, and that's peaking up at around 93% instantaneous penetration in South Australia. However, you can see with those steep cliffs and troughs, that can change very, very quickly, and we need to be able to see that coming in order to configure the grid to be able to support that reliably and keep the lights on. This is what we like to call our ramp bubbles, or bubble tea, but this just shows off, again, the rate of change of that mix. So you've again got the penetration on your vertical axis, and then your change in megawatts over 30 minutes on your horizontal axis. So back in 2008, a nice stable system, not much is changing. Skip forward, 2018, and you've got much higher penetrations, and you can see some quite large ramps, pushing up to 700 megawatts in half an hour, which is a significant change in a short period of time. And then to 2021, you can see we're closing up at 93, 94%. Our ramps are getting bigger, and there's a lot more solar contributing to the ramps as transient cloud cover really starts to impact the grid. So again, just highlighting the dynamic nature of what we're working with. This slide hopes to illustrate that in a slightly different manner. You can see back in the day we had a large sphere of control and low uncertainty. Today our uncertainty is growing and our sphere of control is diminishing, and we don't want to get to the undesirable future state where we keep the lights off. I'm going to skim through these slides because we've covered this already. Again, just showing stability, and this is showing a typical forecast, but what can actually happen due to a change in cloud cover. So the dotted line in light pink is our forecast, the dark purple is what actually happened. So you can see we don't always get things right. And if that's not fun enough, Mother Nature likes to get involved and throw things at us as well, like bushfires, dust storms, tornadoes, and convective downbursts. The latter of which are very good at bringing down transmission infrastructure in South Australia, as we can see in the lower right picture. And the New South Wales and Victorian bushfires from 1920 had significant impact on solar generation, as well as obviously health implications in people's lives. So where to from here? Firstly, I guess where we are today, we've developed a number of situational awareness tools. That image is just showing that we pipe real-time data from all the Bureau weather stations around the country that updates every minute, and we pipe that into the control room so we can see cool changes or weather changes happening in real time and reconfigure the grid, as well as other bespoke tools, which I probably don't have time to go into too much today. I will touch on some of the other models similar to Peter's team. We've redeveloped some of our AWEFs and ASEFs models, which are our Australian wind energy forecasting and Australian solar energy forecasting models. And by redeveloping these in-house using open source software over the last year or so, we've been able to realize an 11 and 14% increase in accuracy, which ultimately results in lower power bills for everybody. So we think that's pretty good. So why Python? In addition to the reasons that Peter mentioned, for our team, being data science oriented, the vast majority of ML development happens in Python and R. There's obviously gives us the ability to dive under the hood, and helps us deliver on our goal of 100% renewables. I'm on my last slide. So yeah, our data science team, and I realize this is a safe space, so I can say this, we've typically been an R shop historically, and we still like R for data wrangling. However, as we're producing more and more production forecasts, we gravitating more towards Python, primarily for, I guess, the reasons Peter mentioned, but in addition, the supporting tooling that it allows us to bring our products to market, so to speak, internally faster with less support than doing it in R. So yeah, that's the end.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We do need to keep the conference on schedule.
No, that's all good. That's it. We're done.
Could we have a thank you for that energizing talk?